Tensions continue to escalate after U.S. strikes on suspected drug boats off the coast of Venezuela.
It began in the late afternoon in the southern Caribbean Sea, along one of the most contested shipping lanes in the Western Hemisphere, just 55 nautical miles off the Venezuelan coast. The sunlight bounced off the waves in chaotic flashes, making the water shimmer like broken glass. Two helicopters emerged low from the eastern sky, an AH-1Z Viper and a UH-1Y Venom, cutting silently across the surface, their engines growling beneath the wind. There were no warning shots, no loud declarations, just a shift in the air as radar alerts began to chime and multiple unidentified objects appeared on the edge of the screen. What followed looked nothing like an exercise. So what is happening in Venezuela? Let's subscribe to Military Power and find out the answer. It began in the late afternoon, off the Caribbean coast, with the kind of glare that made the ocean look like molten glass. Sunlight bounced off the waves in chaotic flashes as the helicopters crept into view. One AH-1Z Viper and a UH-1Y Venom slicing through the sky just above the surface. Their engines roared low, barely distinguishable from the hum of salt air, but their presence altered everything in the rhythm of that horizon. Below them, ships moved slowly through contested waters, their decks littered with gear, their crews locked in silent preparation. The weight of expectation hung in the air, dense and electric. Inside the cockpit of the Viper, the threat warning radar began to chirp. The system had detected multiple low-flying objects entering the outer boundary of the exercise area, closing fast at shallow altitudes. Operators scanned for confirmation. What came next wasn't commercial. These were fast, agile, and flying with precision that pointed to pre-programmed vectors, not pilot error, UAVs, unidentified, silent, and hostile information. A burst of static gave way to a terse transmission. Contacts confirmed, 6 in total, 5 airborne and 1 moving across the water at 45 knots, traced by infrared signatures. The Marines on board didn't hesitate. They had rehearsed this moment for months. Now the script had vanished, replaced by instinct and coordination. Door gunners aboard the Venom opened up first, unleashing a controlled burst from the .50 caliber machine gun. The sound cracked the sky in rhythmic pulses, each round tracing a streak of light toward the lead drone. At 800 meters out, the drone jinked right, reacting just a half second after the initial volley, wobbling under the supersonic pressure of displaced air. The evasive maneuver wasn't improvised, it was calculated. Someone had programmed these machines to survive. More drones scattered like birds under artillery fire, weaving in opposite arcs while the surface contact maintained its speed. The Viper pilot issued a command for hunter-killer tactics. He would dive low while the Venom climbed, thereby separating the angles of attack and minimizing the risk of friendly fire. The ballet of blades unfolded over the ocean in exacting symmetry. Just as the first drone crossed into the inner perimeter, the Venom's co-pilot locked on and fired. The APKWS rocket detached from its rail with a short, sharp whump, the launch plume briefly enveloping the fuselage. The missile climbed briefly before dipping hard, chasing the laser signature dancing across the target's hull. Moments later, the drone disintegrated mid-air, scattering burning fiber and scorched lithium. Still, 4 more UAVs remained in the air, and none were fleeing. Instead, they broke formation, not in panic, but as if executing a synchronized evasion drill. Below, the surface contact angled slightly east, heading straight for a maritime fuel line node marked on the internal map. If it reached that point, interception would become politically impossible. Civilian vessels were now within visual range. One misfire here would change the narrative entirely. Midway through the engagement, the Venom's co-pilot whispered coordinates into the encrypted comms line. Target 2 had just passed into optimal laser range. The co-pilot steadied the beam despite the vibration of the airframe. Wind shear rocked the helicopter sideways, but he held the laser centered. This rocket had only one shot. If it missed, the drone would have free access to the shipping corridor. The trigger was pulled. Another rocket burst forward, spinning in a corkscrew trajectory toward a drone that ducked and surged in counter-movement. The projectile caught its tail and erupted into a fireball. Debris showered the water below. 2 confirmed kills. The gunners reloaded, sweat already soaking their gloves. Meanwhile, the Viper veered left and banked hard. Inside, the pilot's helmet-mounted display synced his vision to the 20-millimeter cannon mounted below. With a slight head tilt, he tracked the third drone cutting across the sky like a hawk. The gun spat out an arc of shells. The first burst missed, but the second stitched the sky with lethal accuracy. The drone lurched, stuttered, and then exploded in a clean, high-altitude burst. That left 2 airborne and 1 still racing across the ocean's surface. The 4th UAV dropped altitude, heading toward a cargo ship from Singapore. If it reached the ship, the Marines would be forced to cease fire. Civilian targets within the blast radius meant risk. Careers had ended for less. The Venom dove to cut it off, its M134 minigun spinning to life with a shrill electrical whine. The operator tracked with intense focus. A 2-second burst turned into 133 rounds, ripping the air like a buzzsaw of fire. The drone tried to veer. It vanished under the weight of ballistic certainty. The 5th drone, sensing the kill, accelerated westward, flying erratically as it attempted to evade a visible lock. The Viper stayed high and steady, adjusting to line up a clean shot. The gunner followed through the belly window, waiting until the drone cleared the debris cloud. He opened fire just as it emerged. The burst struck true. One final burst of orange light confirmed the 5th destruction. Only the vessel on the surface remained. The co-pilot adjusted the display, checking wind direction and trajectory. The Hellfire missile slung under the Viper's wing glinted as it armed. The geometry of the strike had to be perfect. Any mistake would send the weapon veering toward neutral shipping. The marine layer thickened. Moisture and salt scattered laser energy. The co-pilot increased power, knowing the battery would suffer as a result. One miscalculation and the missile would never find its mark. He adjusted 3 times. Wind, angle, drift. The moment arrived. With a clean launch tone, the Hellfire screamed off the rail. 20 seconds later, it plunged into the vessel's frame, disintegrating it into a column of water, smoke, and metal shards. 6 targets, 6 kills, 12 minutes. Just minutes after the final detonation, the sea resumed its natural rhythm, but the atmosphere above remained charged. Pilots rotated back to formation, and helicopters circled overhead in tight orbits, scanning the zone for any stragglers or undetected threats. Far in the distance, a fleet oiler emerged from the haze, slowly approaching the exercise area to refuel the airborne units. Even in simulation, fuel ran low, and logistics never paused. Inside the operations center aboard the USS Gerald R. commanders reviewed every frame of the engagement. Their screens were filled with overlays, thermal traces, drone trajectories, and live telemetry from both rotary and fixed-wing assets. No detail was missed. Every decision would be scrutinized and rerun during the debrief. To the outside observer, it looked like overkill. 6 drones and a boat. Hardly a fleet. But that was never the point. The exercise was not about numbers. It was about timing, coordination, and the projection of force in complex, high-risk environments where mistakes could trigger real-world consequences. And in the skies above Puerto Rico, something else was unfolding. The FAA had issued a NOTAM, a notice to airmen, warning pilots of hazardous air congestion around San Juan. This wasn't routine. It marked the invisible boundary where exercises become signals and where airspace becomes a stage for deterrence. Those who have seen similar NOTAMs in the Middle East are familiar with the pattern. One day it's a drill, the next a strike. If you believe this level of readiness still matters, tap like, share your thoughts, and stay with us. Because the next part reveals why these drills are sounding increasingly like a warning shot. The Gerald R. was never built to hide. From the moment it entered the Caribbean, its sheer presence sent a clear message. At over 1,100 feet long and loaded with 4 squadrons of fighter jets, it cast a shadow not just on the sea, but on the entire region. It sat just outside Venezuelan waters, supported by nearly a dozen other ships, including destroyers, amphibious transports, and supply vessels. Approximately 12,000 U.S. personnel were deployed across this maritime network, marking the most significant military presence in the Caribbean since the Cold War. To those watching from the outside, the mission was labeled as a readiness drill. But inside Navy command centers, the tone had shifted. The planners were no longer just measuring performance. They were checking the timing. Every aircraft launched from the Ford carried more than its standard loadout. It carried intent. And in this part of the world, intent speaks louder than any press release. Not far from the carrier, Reaper drones lifted off again from a forward base in Aguadilla, Puerto Rico. These aircraft were not here for show. They were armed with Hellfire missiles, watching the same waters where small boats and drones had crossed before. These drones could remain airborne for hours, scanning every wake, every heat signature, every vessel that moved outside the shipping lanes. The Reapers followed routines, but every takeoff could become real at any moment. A single call from the carrier group could shift them from passive surveillance to direct engagement in under 5 minutes. That was not a theory. That was protocol. For U.S. military leaders, the growing unpredictability in Venezuela has forced a new level of caution. They do not want to strike first. However, they are ensuring that if provoked, they will not be caught unprepared. Every training run has a mirror version stored inside a real-world contingency plan. The Gerald R. Ford is more than a carrier. It is a floating operations base that controls battle rhythms across air, sea, and digital lines. From inside its combat information center, commanders can track every aircraft in a 50-mile radius. They can call in support from the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit, which remains on standby with amphibious gear ready, or redirect attack aircraft mid-flight if a threat appears near an oil platform or civilian vessel. That level of control is what allows these drills to blur the line between practice and preparation. Over the past week, the scope of those drills has expanded. Fighter pilots from the Ford executed simulated bomb runs just outside Venezuelan airspace. Marines practiced close-quarters deck shooting against fast-moving targets while underway. On at least one occasion, an F-18 flew a low pass across a mock enemy radar site set up on a separate Navy ship. The goal was to replicate conditions they might encounter during a real strike against hardened Venezuelan positions. Though no missiles have been fired in anger, the pressure is rising. The equipment used in these exercises is not defensive in nature. It is designed for offensive action. The deck shooting sessions simulate sudden confrontations with speedboats. The bomb drills mimic strikes on hardened bunkers or hidden launch pads. And the drone interceptions recreate the same patterns seen in previous unclaimed intrusions. Everything suggests the Pentagon is studying Venezuela's coastline as a possible battlefield. However, while the military moves in silence, those closest to the operation feel its weight in a different way. In Puerto Rico, the mood is changing. At first, many residents welcomed the arrival of more American hardware. The jets flying overhead reminded them of U.S. power. They felt protected. For years, Puerto Rico has faced political ambiguity regarding its role in national defense. Seeing F-35s thunder across the sky every morning sent a message. This island mattered. Stores near Roosevelt Roads Naval Station started selling more patriotic merchandise. Local media highlighted the drills as evidence of Puerto Rico's strategic importance. Some officials even praised the Navy's choice to stage from here, calling it a clever use of regional assets. But as the exercises continued, a second voice began to rise. More and more people began to worry that Puerto Rico might be pulled into something bigger. If the United States launched a strike against Venezuela, what would stop Caracas from firing back? They have missiles, even if outdated. They have fast patrol boats, They have political reasons to retaliate. And Puerto Rico, sitting exposed on the front edge of U.S. operations, could be the nearest target. One retired teacher said she had never seen this much military activity since Hurricane Maria. But this time, she added, it is not a rescue. It feels like a storm coming the other way. The local government has responded with cautious messaging. While supporting the military presence, officials have also asked residents to prepare for extended airspace restrictions. They warned about the increase in low-flying aircraft and urged fishermen to stay within safe corridors. In downtown San Juan, some businesses have begun adjusting their hours, citing the unpredictable noise levels from overflights. A few families reported that their children were having trouble sleeping at night due to the constant sounds of aircraft. These are not just inconveniences. They are reminders that the island is not a bystander. It is part of the front. Even those who trust the military are uneasy about what might come next. The noise of drills is different from the silence before action, and silence, for many here, would be more frightening. The presence of drones and deck gunners may calm some nerves, but for others, it feels like a countdown. In a region already strained by economic hardship and political instability, the fear of becoming a flashpoint is growing. The drills are meant to reassure, but their scale and frequency suggest that something bigger is being planned. Whether it is a warning or a warm-up, nobody can be sure. But few on the island believe this is just routine anymore. The sea near Venezuela remains calm for now. But the platforms are loaded. The missions are logged. The Marines are trained and watching the horizon. And in Puerto Rico, beneath the sound of fighter jets, people are starting to ask the question that matters most. What happens if someone crosses the line? That question will soon be answered because beyond the drills and worry lies a more dangerous layer. The politics of confrontation and the silence that often precedes a strike. The first time it happened, there was little media coverage. A small boat went down in the Caribbean Sea. The United States said it was a strike against a drug smuggler, but when the bodies were pulled from the water, most of them had no weapons, no cargo, and no apparent connection to any cartel. By the time it happened again, questions were already spreading. Over several weeks, U.S. forces hit more than 20 suspected drug vessels near Venezuelan waters. Official reports claimed these boats were transporting narcotics and posed a security threat. But after the smoke cleared, the death toll reached 83 civilians. Most of them were never officially tied to any criminal organization. Local groups listed at least a dozen as fishermen. The United Nations responded quickly. Human rights observers raised concerns about the legality of these strikes. The High Commissioner said the killings might be considered extrajudicial. There were calls for an independent investigation. Some countries demanded that the U.S. provide evidence, names, and justification for every target hit. Washington did not respond with new details. Instead, it shifted the focus to Maduro. In Caracas, the message from the Venezuelan government was direct. They said the United States was not stopping drugs. It was preparing for regime change. Officials pointed to the growing U.S. military presence near their coastline. They showed photos of American ships just miles from their exclusive economic zone. They said the deaths at sea were only the beginning of a bigger plan. Inside state-run media, the story took on a different tone. Anchors no longer talked about diplomacy. They spoke of defending national dignity. They reminded the public about previous coups in Latin America. They said the U.S. wanted Venezuela's oil. They warned that even if the Americans came with firepower, the people would meet them with resistance. President Trump gave a short statement that only added fuel to the fire. While speaking to reporters in Florida, he said he was open to discussions with Maduro. However, he also added that he had not ruled out the possibility of military action. His words were brief, but they created a storm across the region. Analysts debated what he meant. Some believed it was a signal that Washington wanted a peaceful transition. Others saw it as a warning that time was running out. One former intelligence official told a news outlet that Trump's words sounded like pre-invasion language. He compared it to the tone used before airstrikes in Syria or raids in Somalia. But unlike those countries, Venezuela is not a distant battlefield. It sits on America's doorstep. The reaction from Venezuela's allies came quickly. Russia's deputy foreign minister stated that Washington was intentionally creating a crisis. He warned that the Caribbean could become a new zone of conflict. China joined the response, saying the U.S. was interfering in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. Both nations issued separate statements declaring their support for peaceful dialogue. But between the lines, there was a clear warning. If the U.S. continued to build pressure, it would not remain a regional issue for long. On the streets of Caracas, many citizens appeared uncertain about what to believe. Some supported the government's message. They were tired of outside pressure. They blamed years of sanctions for their broken economy. Others quietly hoped that talks with the U.S. might lead to change. But fear ran deep. People remembered what had happened in other countries where military options had become a reality. The term limited strike began to appear more frequently in both foreign and domestic reports. Journalists described a possible operation that would target command posts, radar stations, and drug launch sites, all located within Venezuela, but carefully selected to avoid hitting civilians. Military planners referred to it as a strategic disruption, a strike designed not to start a war, but to force Maduro into a corner. The phrase sounded clean on paper, but everyone knew that even one wrong missile could turn limited into something much larger. In private circles, defense experts warned that if a limited strike failed to create political change, it could lead to chaos. Maduro might survive the blow and strike back with militia groups or cyber attacks. Rebel factions might rise in unexpected places, or worse, new alliances might form between Venezuela and nations already hostile to the U.S. Inside Congress, voices were divided. Some lawmakers backed the idea of decisive action. Others feared that the U.S. was repeating mistakes from past decades. The debate was not about whether Maduro should go. It was about how much risk the country was willing to accept to make that happen. For now, no missiles have been fired from the ford. The Marines remain in position. The Reapers continue to fly over warm water, and the radios stay open, listening for a word that could change everything. But that word may not come from Washington or Caracas. It may come from the silence before the next flight takes off. When you put all the pieces together, the picture becomes hard to ignore. The U.S. is not just training near Venezuela, it is doing so closer than ever, with live coordination between drones, jets, and warships operating around the clock. The FAA issued a NOTAM over Puerto Rico due to unusual levels of military air traffic. Reaper drones now fly daily from local bases, fully armed. Fighter jets from the USS Gerald R launch multiple times a day, and the people living under those flight paths are starting to feel the pressure. President Trump's statement left the door wide open. He said he was willing to talk, but also made it clear that military options remain on the table. That dual message, mixed with the visible show of force, has created real anxiety, especially in Puerto Rico, where residents fear their island could become the front line if anything goes wrong. Looking at the current tempo, it is clear that deterrence is only part of the mission. The U.S. is preparing for something more. The most likely scenario would be a limited strike, a short, targeted attack on radar systems, drone launch points, or smuggling vessels linked to Venezuela's military. Another possibility is a sudden clash at sea, especially if fast boats or unmarked drones get too close again. For now, everything is quiet. But this was not a regular training exercise. It was a test of response, a countdown in plain sight. And if you want to be the first to know when that line gets crossed, follow military power, because the moment things go loud, you'll hear it here first. This time, it ended with no smoke. Next time, it may begin with it.